It might be crucial to attempt to understand other perspectives, even though very often it requires a lot of effort and dedication. Ultimately, it gives you way much richer understanding of the social world. But the process itself can be extremely challenging because you have to confront your own point of view with point of view of other people. In this episode, together with Kay, we try to explore exactly this topic by using examples from art and politics to better understand whether we should really look at the world from different perspectives or prioritize our own perspective. So if you like the podcast, please share with your friends, and as always, enjoy. So I wanted to ask you, because we will talk today a lot about perspectives.
Right.
Do you think that every perspective really matters?
Oh, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
Well, matters to whom? Like, matters to me personally? I think every perspective matters to the person, obviously. But does every perspective matters to me? No. Does every perspective matters in the society in large? Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
And the way that we want to sort of maximize the benefit of democracy is to make it like more inclusive always. So if all the perspective can ideally matter someday,
Yeah.
I mean, that would be probably cool.
Yeah, because what I thought, of course, whether every perspective has a credit and whether we should really carefully understand every perspective. Or because, I mean, it gets tricky, right? Because there's so many perspectives that you probably don't want to hear or don't want to listen to. Or you don't want to give them a credit. And this is what I struggle with a lot. That's I guess what we discussed, because it feels like in the West, and I guess like for us, like, because I mean I would be honest, like we come from countries that are kind of outliers in the West, and obviously like perspectives of those countries and people from those countries, I mean, they're not really heard, or and people don't want to listen to those perspectives. And like for me, like the personal struggle is, of course, that they rather want to hear how you buy like Western perspective. Like, if a person from Russia, like what they really want to hear is like, how badly Russia sucks from Russian people. Like, this is what they want to hear.
Yes, but I think there is also a problem of a propagation of those narratives, because what they hear from Russia in the West is totally bullshit. That's not the real perspective.
Yeah, because they want some
and they
different...
obviously hate it because it's so bullshit. And that's what many of these medias work in terms of like creating this outrage, because like the right would get like the most insane people from the left, and then the left would do the same thing just to get a reaction, especially now with social media. But then I think I would like to think that people are thirsty for a new perspective, but just this constant propagation of this narrative about Russia is just people just fed up with, and that's why they don't want to listen to it. But if they actually get, a real perspective that is thoughtful and insightful from Russia, I don't think people would be against that.
But the more I live in the West, the more I understand that they're really not, like, they're deeply uninterested in listening to other perspectives, because they're so kind of into their own perspective. There's, like, in other words, that's what we discussed, like, I guess, like, off mic, that they really hold up to their own beliefs. They believe that, like, those kind of beliefs that they're fundamental, like almost like fundamental to human nature. You can also say they're universal, and everything that doesn't really fit those beliefs, I mean, it doesn't deserve like it doesn't deserve even to be carefully analyzed, just because it's so off their own worldview. and so on.
Yeah, but I have one question. Do you think they actually get a real perspective from Russia, or the perspective they get is just by Western media that's always trying to shit on Russia?
Try to shit on Russia.
You know, I mean, that's
So
that's
it's
exactly
the
the thing.
perspective.
They've never even got that perspective.
Yeah.
So obviously, if I get that perspective, and I think that is the perspective,
Yeah.
and I don't criticize the media, and don't try to be critical about everything that I hear, then obviously I would be like, yeah, this is obviously bullshit. Like Russia is, quote unquote, obviously a terrorist state and shit like that, which is the thing that you get from all the media that you especially like in the West. I'm talking about the West, and like you always see like Putin is lying, is like just one today I saw like, oh yeah, Putin is just verbreitet, like they spread it so much lies and one after another, and I'm like, yeah, that's your title. Like a completely biased, So obviously, I think that the core of the problem is that people don't even get that. They don't even get the opportunity to get that perspective. They just always mediated by this Western news media, which is, people don't really criticize it as well.
Yeah.
And then when I started listening to podcasts, I was like, damn, CNN was just a bullshit.
Oh yeah, it is bullshit.
It's so crazy. Even like Reuters, like those hard news.
They are like completely like, especially the war intensified this, but I think the seeds of this kind of like Western, arrogance and just like this inability to understand that they're just different perspectives in the world. It's just like mind blowing, because those people. I think they do like deeply believe that they are doing like just like neutral analysis, like.
Oh, for sure.
Because I don't think they're very like evil people who do it intentionally, like do some type of propaganda. But like they end up doing propaganda, but they don't really think about it as propaganda.
Yeah, I would say some of it obviously is biased. All of us are biased in our own perspective, and some of it is just. It's sad that you don't really get that perspective in Europe. Me, if I didn't have a friend like you, I would probably be the same, because where do you even get it? Like, I don't know Russian. And there is no media that I can consume that I get that perspective.
Yeah, that's why it's really sad.
Exactly. And I think that is at the core of the problem. That is like people don't eat. Yeah, obviously part of it is bias, part of it is media, and was one more. Yeah, one of it is obviously like tribalism. Like you just don't want to be like lonely. I feel like these days, especially, I don't know, maybe after pandemic is a little bit more intensified, but like this sort of weaponizing loneliness against people, just labeling them and making them an outlier, and people just stop listening to these people because they feel like this is conspiracy theory.
Tribal, exactly. But for me, it's also like a personal struggle here. It's like, how do you go from here? Like, because I understand that it's not like, again, it's like very hard position to be in, because like you're probably going to be always judged by your nationality. But it's not like I want to say that I support Putin or anything like this. But what I want to say is like, you have to be just open to listening to other people. Just start with this, just like a very simple point. And somehow when I moved here, I truly believe that like West is all about this. Like, it's all about listening to other people. It's all about individuality. And then like for me, like the whole the world changed when I realized that like whatever like people like in Russia, like in elite said about the West, it turned out to be kind of right. And this is like, you made like this like
deep state.
It's like you made like this turn, like in terms of like your worldview, that like to a certain degree they are right to say that the West is imperial, and the West completely the West doesn't care about other perspectives. It's all about its own perspective, and it truly believes that its perspective is the one.
Exactly, because if you put aside the demonizations of these sort of perspectives in the media or in society, there is truth to those as well. Like even in the Middle East, when you have these crazy countries, they have this like super, anti-American, or like anti-West propaganda. But also when you get into it, we see, okay, I mean, some of this is historically correct. I mean, they did fuck with these countries in a lot of way. They did stop them from like reaching democracy and democratic like sort of like political structure. They did do that, so they also have some truth in them, even though like these are like super. I would even say like these are extreme, politicians. But that's I agree with you. But I hope that with this type of like what we talked about before the podcast, the new media that is the podcasting and is more independent and doesn't rely on the money of like big corporations and stuff. I think we start to hear that actually. I think it nowadays is much better than the times that we didn't even know this perspective existed.
Yeah, that's I mean, obviously true, and I guess the great hope. But it's also for me, it's just interesting. How do you go from there? How do you talk to like actually Western people? Because it seems like it's hard to find people who are open-minded nowadays in the West. I mean, I guess it's not just about like war in Ukraine. I guess it's also about different topics like pandemic, like coronavirus, whatever you have. Like they do have like this narrow-minded focus and just like this, like the narrative that they believe in, they really think is the one.
Yeah.
And like somehow for me it's so surprising, because those are the same people that believe in those like ideas of like different type of genders and different type of I mean they do believe that
they believe it because they're also established narratives. If they were like 50 years ago, they would not do that. I would assume. I agree with you 100% that there, because this also caused by our sort of perspective of West, when we realized that West is also, there's a lot of bullshit going on here as well. And then we had this very like elitist, maybe like very high regarded image of the West, that people here are so critical. And then you see people all over the world, they're kind of in the same sort of level average. They just believe in different propaganda.
True, but could you make like a case for the West? Because I still feel what I also struggle with. It's like, okay, but I also do think there is a level of like liberty in the West that it's really not achievable. Like I think in Russia or Iran, for example,
right?
It's like there is like this sense of being individual, but somehow like this individuality is of course filtered by those like meta narrative that they have, right?
Right.
So some things are not really acceptable, right?
Yeah.
Only things that like kind of like Western, or like they filtered through this kind of like bubble of, or just like it has to pass certain filter.
Yeah.
Like this narrative who we are, so to speak. And of course, here is like a struggle, because what to think about it. For me, it's still I haven't made my mind, so to speak, in terms of I just sometimes feel not lost, but like in a sense of like I just truly want to understand how I can talk to these people openly without being judged.
Yeah. I think you're, in terms of just respond to what you said about liberty. Yeah, I think obviously there is more liberty here, but then also I think the propaganda is much more intelligent.
Yeah.
I mean, there is this huge like democratic structure, but for example, in the US, you have the deep state as well. Yeah.
But it's also interesting whether it's way much more intelligent, or whether they have just way much more resources. Like, you know what I mean? Like in a sense, you have not just CNN, you have CNN, Reuters, and you have also like all this media in Germany. Yeah. They work kind of in unison. So it's like they present the same narrative from different type of like national angles, but eventually it's still the same narrative.
Right.
There's no big difference.
Yeah.
It's like there is no real critical thinking there.
No.
People that just eat it up. They just like really.
Yeah, but would you agree it's a little bit more nuanced?
Of course, yeah.
Than like countries like Russia, or?
I think it's
the
I mean,
propaganda is just kind of like it's really hard to prove it wrong.
and depending on topics, I think like the war in Ukraine is actually like pretty simplistic. It's like
Right.
it's not it's really that simplistic. It's not that different actually from Russian like narrative in terms of it's just like that simplistic. It's like I mean the way the wording, the phrases that they use, it's like this like evil versus like good versus evil like
Obviously.
struggle.
Right.
Which I mean to me, it's also like super like Christian and super like almost like you could see the notes of kind of dogmatic like religion here. Like
Right.
we are the right
Yeah.
side, they are the wrong side, and we are fighting for the good causes, and they're the bad guys. It's like Russia is like exactly the opposite. Like it's like just basically saying the same thing. Like those are bad people, we are good people.
Yeah.
It's like also like yeah, and I think of course it's like it's way much more sophisticated and nuanced, but it ends up like just a propaganda. In the end of the day, propaganda is propaganda. Like
Yeah.
maybe, but also they have obviously way many more people working and way many more channels and way many more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I meant. Like, that's what makes them more intelligent in a sense that they have those resources, so they're more effective.
Yeah,
You know, and I think that's actually a very nice segue about something that I also like noted. I wanted to talk that you talk about liberty and this like how people just buy into this narratives, and sometimes I feel like the change in like human beings, especially like when we talk about politics and progress, is that we have a structure. Let's say we have this government who is kind of like a little bit of oppressive about like dissent voices, and then you have a government after that which is the complete opposite, but still the structures are of the same. I mean, let me give you an example. I mean, of the U.S., like you had like this Republicans like during Trump, they were like kind of like seen as very conservative, and then you have Biden, and then you see the processes or the sort of like the outcome is kind of very much the same because the system hasn't changed. It's like a different voice, but in the same way, like you have now people from the left who are trying to sort of oppress people from their voices, which is like, oh, this is the thing that you were fighting against when people like the Republicans were in power. You were just saying no, they're sort of like they're censoring and stuff, and now you're doing exactly the same, but just with a different ideology.
Yes, and it's interesting if you make this. Kind of extend this idea, and to be honest, when you analyze a little bit critically the relationship between like ordinary people and elites, you see there is really little leverage that you can do even if you're in a democratic country. Well, you do go to ballots like once in like 4 years, and this is your connection to the people in power.
Exactly.
It's like, you do really believe that you influence their decision making?
I mean, like, compared it with the PACs as super PACs, like these big corporations that basically own politicians, especially in the US. How much really is the average person's influence on the politics versus this big corporation?
Exactly. So there is like I think there is like the very little connection between like, ordinary people and people in power.
And that's basically the premise of, I mean, not a premise, but it's that's how democracy is.
Yeah, and it's also maybe how power works. Like, it's just like maybe in Russia, people are way much more cynical and they know it. They know they have no connection. And like everyone knows that you have no connection to Putin. And there is no like, illusion. I mean, there are like elections and you can maybe argue that he's like a popular autocrat, like in the sense like some people support him. Yeah, true, but they don't have illusion that like their like small lives matter, like in terms of like deciding like fates of humanity. No, I mean they're like brutally honest that they don't matter. And I mean maybe people in the West should also, I mean, at least be open to understanding this or like listening to this perspective. Because I do think like this whole narrative that there's that much going like on in democracy in terms of like a civil control of power or over authorities. I think this is just bullshit. Like, you know, it's like the more you live in the West, as you said, because like to me, what you said in terms there's no change. It's like you may have different type of people in government or different type of red or blue people, but it ends up being the same type of politics,
Right.
with no big difference. Because you just see different faces in your TV. But it's
Exactly. And for me, when you take a step back and look at like the big picture, I always feel this type of affinity with Kafka. It's like you with these political structures, you always have this gigantic bureaucratic system that it's probably its biggest advantage is that it doesn't allow a dictator to come and like stay there forever.
That's true, actually, yeah.
But it's always above people. Like it's nobody actually can change the system in a sense. Like Kafka was very, very much genius in pointing that out. It's like, especially in Metamorphosis, with this guy turned into a cockroach.
Yeah.
But still, the first thing that comes to his head, first concern is, how can I get to work? Where can I get to work? Which is like, imagine this system inside this guy's brain that is so bigger than us. We kind of like caved inside. I mean, obviously, it has some benefits, and the biggest benefit that I mentioned. But then you get really caved inside this structures that change just becomes, you know, it's always like I said, the next regime is sort of like an irony of the last one, because it's just that in terms of like structures and how it does things, but it's just with a different ideology.
Yeah, and it's also it makes me think that the only type of politics that you can have is just the one on the local level. It's like
grassroots.
Not even grassroots, like the type of politics is like how to clean my own like block of flats, like, you know, what to do with the management of my house.
Okay,
that's type of like here is also like a politics, and you can actually have a real opinion, like, you know, like I don't want as we discussed, I mean, I want to buy like a second fucking like third trash bin for like a paper, like, you know, it's like I don't want to like rip these things apart every time. This is all it's so your perspective you bring here, right? You know, and you have to have like you know, balls to make it happen.
Yeah,
you have to have certain power. But the more you go, like the more abstract you go in terms of like this level of state, you know, you have like a city, then you have like this idea of a state. Like here that things become like very kind of fuzzy, because like the state is kind of like its own thing. There is no real connection between state and people. Like it is its own institute. It is its own like network of individuals.
Right.
And I guess like it's like, to me it's just I would say once I moved here, and over time I started realizing it, I would say more and more, that connection is like illusionary. Which, I mean, again, funny, because like people in Russia say it all the time.
Right.
But you don't really buy into it, because you still have hopes that, you know, it's like different.
Oh yeah, I mean, people everywhere, I think there is this sort of craving for a utopia. You know, even people here, when you talk to, I mean, I talk to some of my classmates, and they like crave for this like socialist state. You know, it's like completely socialist state, and I realize, man, like this German person that I talked to, and you realize you are probably in one of the best functioning democracies in the world. I mean, in terms of like what we have right now, but you still crave for something like a utopia that is like, I don't know, so just far away. But I don't want to get into that. But I just want to just get back to something that you said about like comparing Russia with the West. So you said people in Russia are more just cynical about it.
I mean,
but you think it's just kind of the same, but it's just there is this illusion of legitimacy.
I mean, there is they just understand that there's that small and there is something that big and they're insignificant. I mean, they don't have this illusion that their decisions just matter. And it goes, I guess, like very deep into Russian psyche since like ages, that there is like this idea of like basic humility and also cynicism in terms of like their lives just don't really matter. And it's like all very like, you know, kind of like a tragic perspective, but the one that maybe, you know, again, as a perspective, it has right to exist and to be understood, because they just understand that things could be better, you know, if like, you know, somehow you have like different type of government, but you know, you don't have a choice. You don't have a word here. Just because there is something that bigger than them, like, you know, like there is like power, there is like a state, and yeah, they kind of subscribe to it just because there's nothing to do here, like, you know.
Yeah, and now I get, yeah, if you want to if you want to explain that to a German
and
person,
you need to just survive, like the whole like
Yeah.
you're just surviving,
yeah,
like, you know.
and when I talk, obviously, yeah, what you say is completely true. How can you, if you want to talk to this German person about, you have an illusion of the legitimacy of the state.
Yeah.
How can you break that? Obviously, they would not want that to break. So this is kind of, I don't know, is a little bit of an aggressive thing, probably seen from their side.
Yeah.
To burst that
or even
bubble.
I would say even it's like a conspiracy theory, like what do you
for sure.
what
It's
do
a
you
house
mean?
of card thing, because if you say that, that means like, okay, Russia,
like,
Germany is no different from Russia.
Yeah, it's like
That's why you're saying.
Exactly, yeah.
But in a different way. That I get it. Like when I think of the United States, for example, and I see, obviously there is this big corporations that drive the politics.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole war machine of the United States is led predominantly by this industrial military complex.
Yeah.
And that's crazy to feel like the biggest military in the world is ruled by this corporations.
But it's like, again, like going back to this connection, it's so stupid to think that every time when people go to ballots in the United States, they should be asked this question: do you want to have a free education or military bases around the world? And like it like, you know,
Exactly.
like ironically they end up like choosing. I mean, there is no one to choose, because like everyone in power supports having bases around the world.
Yeah.
Because there's no connection, like, you know. But if it was really up to you to have, like, you know, like free education for your children, I don't know, better healthcare system, you know, maybe no shootings, or like, at least like some like improved quality of life. Right. Like everyone would go for improved quality of life because that's what matters to you. But you have like this like illusion. Like also, but in the US it gets really cynical, because like 50% of population they don't really vote. So they also saying like, well, who cares? Like, man, like really, do you really think it matters? But this is also a cynical part, because I mean they talk about democracy and stuff, but they also like, you know, admit that like majority of population in some countries, they just don't go to ballots.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm not very knowledgeable about like the underlying reasons of why people don't vote. Like that portion of population does not vote in the United States. But yeah, I mean, you're correct. Like people go to vote, but the choices they have is already been decided for.
Yeah,
you know,
it's
they're
like
already
this,
like, okay, you cannot just have everything right now. You,
No,
you
no,
have
no.
this and that. And it's always you end up with some lesser evil type of situation. And yeah, I mean that's a problem. Like obviously in the West, you have like we said. You have this like democratic structure, but then you have this corporations, which I would call like the deep state that people call them, and that is the thing. Like, there is this democratic, you know, structure, but it's basically ruled by the money that has come from the deep state. So you have, like you said, there's that illusion. Like you have this thing, you have this facade, so to say, that people believe in.
Yeah.
And obviously, one thing that I and you, I guess, we both appreciate here is like the freedom of speech, right?
True.
But that's also creates that type of illusion. Okay, if the states are against this, why doesn't just everyone end up in a prison? But then the way they do it is not that they don't put you in prison, but they just label you or just like corner you as like conspiracy theory, or this person that is like cannot really compete with the mainstream media and narrative. And then people just stopped listening to you, because that is so powerful, the way the Western propaganda works, that just makes everything against it a sort of like, you know, a conspiracy theory that people just kind of laugh at you, and you instantly become alienated if you
Yeah.
start spouting that misinformation. quote unquote.
Yeah, true, but they also, I think they really believe that whatever they are doing in their worldview is like really like the one that should be. Like
yeah,
there's
I
like
definitely agree with you.
hubris of like, so like, I mean, all the civilizational talk, I guess it just proves it, like, in terms of they really believe that they are the ones. Like, I guess what we maybe discussed like off mic, it's like they really believe they're the chosen people, like, in terms of like almost like in a religious sense.
Yeah, I mean, there obviously you can look at it two ways. I mean, obviously, I don't know if you would agree, but they still have some advantages over like we like talk
Yeah.
like freedom of speech and
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
this illusion. They have at least this facade, right?
Yeah.
and that facade just makes it better than just freedom of speech. Just makes it better from like the countries that like Russia and in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So they actually, to some extent, have a better system. But then I also agree with you that there is this Eurocentrism. That is,
Yeah.
we are better. We are, but and by the virtue of being better, our perspective matters, and that is the one that matters.
Yeah, but it's also, to me, the question is whether this is like really sustainable over long term, because obviously this is like a real deep, like, hubris, like in terms of the idea that their perspective is the one that's like really divine. It's almost like it's like above everyone's perspective.
Yeah.
And like, it's like, I mean, they think that these just their perspective. It's like there's no way, because I mean they frame it in many different ways. They frame it as like you like rationality, like as normative thinking, like the one that is like really above other like type of ways of perceiving the world. And then of course, like as you said, but they're also very dissatisfied with what they have, so they always need something more. It's like, in a sense, if their perspective is the best one, why they don't shut up and just like live their best life in their country? Why they need to go somewhere to prove that they're the best? And like this is like type of, almost like a Western imperialism. They're never satisfied,
Right.
and they always go on those adventures to do somewhere, like to build something somewhere else,
Right.
that is legitimately better.
Right.
And they end up in this kind of like vicious cycle, like really inflicting a lot of pain in the world.
True.
And then they kind of like, and they never really feel sorry about this. So it's also almost like, they feel they really kind of like, they have to do it and they have the right to do it. And they end up like, inflicting a lot of pain. But they just simply kind of like, how do you talk to those people who have like this above perspective? Because it's really hard, like if you think about it.
And I think, I mean, obviously historically we read so much about it. I mean, to some extent it's rooted in like this crusades and this type of like the expansion of your religion type of thing. And I think it's definitely also amplified by this industrial revolution and like just going to the country for the like raw materials, which is like continue to exist right now with like cobalt and other minerals like that. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Like before we talked about it, I kind of like came up with this the feeling of insecurity that is here, and maybe that is the way, like by proving that over and over again they maintain this narrative that they did. Obviously, people try to put cracks in this narrative that no, West is not the best. There are dissent voices here, not even in art and politics and media all over. But then probably the way they maintain it is just to go invade another country and show their military dominance, and then they create a whole new narrative about then it takes like 20 hours, like the invasion of Iraq, but then it doesn't even matter.
We can go like very interesting direction, because again, the way you use the West here, it's especially interesting because of course like the whole idea of the West is a construct, like because the thing is, the West is like, what is the West? Like there's like a maybe German way of
United States, bro.
Yeah, but I mean like, when we say it, we imply way much more, right? We imply like way many more countries and many more ideas. And it's interesting because like it probably should be like there is a German way of living, there is a French way of living, there's a British way of living, like there's an American way of living, but it doesn't mean that they're all the same way of living. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But this is again imperial and kind of geopolitical project that kind of like the US is having. And like my problem is that this is exactly this universal perspective. It's like, you know, I mean, but even the whole, like, you know, if you think it's like a signifier is stupid, like the West, like it's like it literally means direction, but direction like doesn't make any sense because all those countries, like they're all around the world, like, you know, exactly, like it's very stupid, like to me. But like, but still people really believe that's a real thing, right? And again, in the West, so to me it gets me every time.
Yeah, and when I listened to your last podcast, which people should go and listen to with David Bozo, I think you tried to somehow I had the impression to give Bozo this idea, or put the seed in his head that, you know, there is European Union, but it's like kind of or maybe completely ruled and controlled by the US, and I wish the EU had actually say in what they do, and they could like organically progress and do their own thing. Except instead of just always being propped by the US.
But it's also interesting what you said about in terms of like the development of culture, and of course there is truth to that there is like in terms of in Germany, because if you take Germany, it is an ally. It's like the perfect ally of Americans with like, you know, military bases, and there's no real development of like real German culture. It feels it's heavily influenced by American culture.
I don't think they're even. I mean, they're allowed to do that. Like, obviously, you know, they kind of like take hostage. But
but that's why we live in America. It was like such a good, I think, criticism and such a like, I mean, brilliant song in terms of like, and by the song they wanted to show you like, like we live in America. It's like we're a fucking colony, guys.
Exactly.
Like they were like very straightforward about this, right? You know.
Yeah, I think. I mean, especially, I think you feel that even more in Germany, like you said, like the culture is not really. I feel like like we said, it's kind of feels fake because it doesn't really. They don't really let it to grow organically, whereas like where you are in France, at least, you know, the domestic culture. It's very much alive, and you know, you feel that. And then obviously when you talk about foreign policy, you get into a whole different thing. Obviously it's, you know,
but an interesting connection, because you do feel even on the cultural level, Germany is way much more American. So it also tries to almost like, and we can like, you know, in terms of like how teenagers behave, they do behave like they're Americans, or they want to kind of be Americans, and they also buy a lot of like Afro-American culture, which is like very weird because it's something that is not theirs, like, you know.
Exactly.
But they want to kind of like be like Americans. And they're really obsessed with Americans, like in a sense. They always discuss Americans, like, you know, everything that happens in America is so important to them. But Americans don't give a damn about what happens in Germany. Like, you know, they just like don't give a shit. Like, you know. Well, like the mics went all crazy. Like, whoa, yeah. So I have to get back to, I don't know. It feels like there's something like a transition happened in the podcast now.
Wait, I have some ideas or down. I always like I was always curious how you got into politics, and would you consider politics as a way that you relate to the world? Like how you see the world. Like let me give you an example. For example, when I was 18, I kind of had this moment of self-awakening that is coincided by finding a lot of movies and getting interested in movies and art in general. So art became sort of my tool to relate to the world. Like every way I look at the world is through art. Every like relationship I have, every sort of connection I have is like always coming back to the movie scene or something like that. And that's how the way I relate. And I think I just wanted to know, is that like politics does that to you? Do you have that type of connection with politics that it kind of relates you, or you relate to the world through politics?
I think in a sense, yeah, it was also when I was like 17, 16. I just got deeply interested in this idea of how people get power, because power seems something so important in the world, like, but also something like fleeting and fuzzy and something that you couldn't really define it well. But
Right.
in a sense, like when you read about people in power, you read about powerful people and you observe powerful people. I mean, like this is like it's still there is such a mystery, like mystery in so many levels. Like, why do people want power, and like why do they even care about power? And it's like what's up with power in terms of like what like why do they really care about like this thing? Like, and why like and could we imagine the world like in different way? And I mean, I got just interested by like I was fascinated by reading a lot about people with power, like different historical figures and different I would say, yeah, like mainly historical figures. And to me it was so interesting because it felt like, there are different, of course there is like science, there is art, but power is something like, it almost like a layer of our psychology that is so like important. Like
Yeah.
it takes such a big chunk of your mental space, and yet like not everyone talks about it freely, or not everyone conceptualize it even. And then of course that started from there, and then I just like got interested into like politics, like, as a field of study. But also I'm just still very curious about like different aspects of power, like from like very micro level, how like people can manipulate each other, like on a very micro, even in relationships and stuff, and like why this happens, like, and like why do they really need this power,
Right.
but also on the macro levels in terms of how do people accumulate power, and how do they like what do they do with this power, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to sort of trace back its roots in yourself. That how did you end up, and how this interest came to be actually,
Yeah.
and why this? Like for example, when I think about how did I end up doing or like relating to the world through art,
Yeah.
when I did it at 18 or start doing it, I was just doing it like not really intentfully.
Yeah.
It's just something that I found, and it was just very spontaneous.
Yeah.
But then it continued, and I realized, okay, there must be something there inside of me that is sort of, even before I discovered art, that made me sort of relate to that. And also, like I said, it really makes you learn more about yourself.
Yeah.
Then I realized, wow, okay, I am a type of a person who leans more on the feeling side. Like
Okay.
I'm not a super like logical. I don't feel like logic always, especially I think after finishing my BA degree, when I realized, because before that I also had this very rosy picture of academia, where you go and everyone just speak their mind, and people are just so free of bias. And then I went there, I was, wow, I feel so much hypocrisy here.
Oh yeah.
And then I realized, wow, I mean, it's not just information that makes you a person who is, how would I say, like a pure, or maybe like a better person, just in general. Like you can still have a lot of information but still be an evil person.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think, especially I think social science academia is especially. I have like a really, again, like talking maybe about like, new ways of conceptualizing and thinking. I think like academia in itself is actually like a rotten place, a social academia, because I don't think there's a like value, like that big value in social academia in comparison, of course, to like hard sciences, because those people really they can make progress and changes, and they're like way much more scientific, while people in academia, they believe in their own dogmas. They have like they kind of like endorse each other, like kind of like a real scientist. But what they kind of create is like this gatekeeper community where they let people in academia, like only those voices that they want to kind of like amplify, or they want to continue spreading the same type of voices. And I mean, especially in international relations, like academia, it becomes very obvious because it's so American. It really like promotes American way of view by saying it's scientific one. So it's like universal
Right.
one. It's
Right.
not American, but like, all institutions, the best institutions, of course, in America. But
Right.
it's not American. It's like universal.
Right.
And of course, like then you start thinking about, wait a minute, but like the whole idea of maybe we should bring just different perspectives.
True.
And I still that's why one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast, because this is a medium like free of like any interference,
Right.
where you can express yourself, and maybe something that you express is way much more like scientific in
Right.
its nature than academia itself.
Yeah, I guess that's also where I kind of lost my faith in science, because I realize how this scientific, even in hard science, like just we talked about, it can be manipulated by politics. It's not just
Very true.
it's not just maybe saying completely wrong things, but just giving you the small nuggets of information to just sort of like control the narrative in a sense. And then you see, okay, that would be pretty much very expected with social sciences, because they're much more nuanced. It would be like much easier to sort of manipulate them, and also like influence them, because they're not also making so much money. They also always have to be funded by the state, and yeah, that's also, I think, one thing that was really big it was kind of like my second awakening when I was in academia and realized, no, it's just not hard science. It's always very much politicized, even like the very like even scientific facts, and then then you get to social sciences, and then when I realized, I'm leaning on a different. I need to lean on a different thing to just lead myself in life. It's not just about. I guess the best thing that I learned from academia was critical thinking, that not believe anything that comes to, even though it's echoed by so many people in the society. You always have to be critical, which is very hard, because you're always the 24-hour news cycle is just coming at you all the way, which is making it super hard, because at some point you have to believe in some people, because you cannot, and some scientists, because you cannot just go in every science and know. You just believe in some certain scientists, and you just get those small nuggets of information from them, especially if they're like in a different discipline than you. And then I realized, I'm kind of like leaning inside this. I don't know how to explain it, but like this feeling side, that like gut feelings,
But as you said, like you still artistic one, like, right?
Exactly.
But like the way, like there's a saying that like people like of course there's a big academic debate, not academic but even philosophical one, that's like everything is about politics. But I actually realized, and for me it was the opposite, because I started with this drive to study politics, right. And after a certain time I started realizing, but wait a minute, but it's all about kind of art. Like in the same way people saying it's all about politics, you could say it's all about art.
Wow.
Because eventually, because it's also art is not just what people call the art. Like, like like the confinement of art is like what people define as the art, in the sense of some confinement of ideas and ways of expressing yourself. But like the whole human life can be art.
Wow.
And it's something I realized, and I actually see it all over again in so many different aspects.
That's so interesting. Yeah, first of all, I would agree with you that a lot of people, I feel like that the understanding or the definition they have from art is like the excellence of a craft. Like when somebody does a thing which is just so good at it, they call it like an art, like an excellence. But I think there is a difference between art and craft.
But would you think Putin is an artist? Would you call him an artist?
I wanted to get there.
No, but that's...
I wanted to, because what you said is really interesting. Because what I understood from your statement was that even politics is so nuanced. that you can treat it as art, because art is the ultimate place for nuance. You know, basically you can do anything in art. It's just
it's all ultimate self-expression, right?
Yeah, but it's also always about challenging the existing structure or this existing method. There's the thing that exists.
I don't think it necessarily it's just like, I think it's actually easier to connect art with attention. Like if something catches your attention, that's artistic. Like in a sense, whether it's in museum, you go and you see like this one painting, you're just like, whoa.
Yeah.
And it also depends on you, because I guess on your perspective, because some things click with you, some things don't. Like, you know, it's okay in terms of like there's so much information and so much artistic works, and you listen that you could listen only that much music.
Right.
And some music you like, some music you obviously don't like. But it's not like that's music. I mean, like these things, it's like, you know, it's all about your taste.
True.
In sense, it also depends on you as a receiver of this art.
Yeah. And also how you look at, I mean, do you look at, I mean, if you're an artist, then you have a different perspective of creating art to, you know, also you are a receiver of art, but you're also a creator. But yeah, I think it's really hard to pin it down like that. I think the way I look at it is just there are different cornerstones of human lives that are appeal to different cognitive abilities or capabilities of human beings. For example, I think philosophy, to a great extent, is all about logic. And then, you know, you have social sciences and politics and stuff like that. And then you have art, which I think predominantly just tries to explain human feelings and emotions, in a sense that trying to find a platform to express those feelings and just nail it down, because it's really, really hard. Even though that's also one thing that I realize in academia, that our feelings are kind of overlooked. And a lot of us taking decisions based on our feelings. And it's like really hard because then you go into psychology and psychoanalysis and then the whole thing becomes kind of fuzzy. But then I've realized, I mean, the best platform for it is just art. And that's how I realized that I kind of empathize with this perspective of art, because, I'm kind of a person who a lot of times search to feel more than to understand, I guess. I love to understand and get like logical about the stuff, but then always I take a step back and look at the whole thing in a sort of like a feeling way, that, like I told you before, how, for example, define God. That I didn't used to believe in God, but now I kind of believe, because my definition of God changed. I don't think of like God as something like a super, power in the sky, but it's just something inside of every human being, that it represents the good, and there's like devil or evil, which represents the bad, and we have this sort of conscious feelings about our decisions, what we do, and feeling good or feeling bad, which obviously can be manipulated. That's where other corners of life come to play, like philosophy and politics and so on and so forth. But then, probably like every person has a more tendency or leaning towards one of these more than the other one.
Yeah, but it's also, if you think about God as some form of art and like creation in a way that like the life itself, like if you think about the complexity of life forms, it's almost like life itself wants to create something. And if you think about like it wants to create different type of species, it's just like give it a chance to create something, and then it explodes. You see like so many different ways, actually, like so many different ways to live this life. Like you can be a human being, but you also can be like a crab. I don't know. You can be like like a whale. Like what does it feel to be a whale? Like probably it does feel something. Like
you're talking about perspectives again.
What does it feel to be like a bird?
Whale. Damn.
What does it feel to be like?
That's a stoner talk right there.
Yeah, but then you go into like a human realm, and in human realm you actually have almost like there's like a layer of like they're living organisms, and on top of like conscious organisms, you have like this explosion of self-perception in terms of so many perspectives.
Interesting. And then and I think that's, for me, it's really interesting that someone like you that comes from the political sort of social science perspective, that sort of gets directed or ends up in this place where also looks at like political science or social sciences general as an art, which I think is really, really interesting because, probably that would something that I also would empathize with as a perspective. But then for me, I will always kind of like doubt myself because I always see like art and I feel like, okay, maybe I'm a little bit biased because I'm always, relating to different topics, maybe through art, and maybe like this people who come from like a political science perspective, they feel different. But for me, it's like actually very super interesting that you think that way, and because I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's being just critical and just trying to understand. And when you are open-minded and you just like explore different ideas, and again, you are dissatisfied maybe with the status quo in academia, then you start analyzing things differently. Then you end up like reading stuff that is like drastically different perspectives, and then you start seeing like something is missing,
right?
Especially in modern academia, social science academia, because it really tries to be science when it's not. Like it's like that's the point. I mean, that's if you really try to be science, you try to pretend that you are science so much, and you have again like this like kind of like the wall that people create that they really believe in, probably they just miss this, like that this is not what it should be, but it should be more like an art, like
I think we're
self-expression.
going back to that sort of like structures and the illusion of legitimacy. It's like also academia creates this illusion of legitimacy by saying it's science, especially like social sciences, or humanities. I mean, humanities, they don't like, claim that, but like social sciences more, I guess. That is, it is science.
Especially like, people like economists, if you think in political, I mean, there is like a reason to put science in political science.
Yeah. And I want to go back to your original questions because it was really interesting. So like you said, do all perspective matters?
So you can reverse now and ask me.
Yeah, and then I wanted to ask you because for me, I feel this a little bit hard to sometimes listen to some perspectives.
Yeah,
because I think it's always some feelings involved. Obviously, like I cannot listen to extreme left person or an extreme right person. But do you think, first of all, do you do that? And second of all, do you think it's necessary to do that?
Yeah, I think it's necessary, and I think it's a skill that is hard.
Why is it so hard, though?
Because you have feelings and you don't agree with people, or you disagree with people and don't want to listen to them.
Do you think we somehow feel insecure about our knowledge and we feel like, it's gonna like fall in like a house of cards?
It's also like this tribalism, and we're just like humans are beings of like comfort, like we're just comfortable with certain ideas, and when someone comes to you and says that you should rethink your thinking, you just don't like it. And it takes a very kind of dedicated person to go and listen to, like, and really
a person who's open to challenge.
Yes, and we can say being empathetic and but again, this is just trying to understand like another person.
And not being insecure about the shit you don't know.
Yeah, but it's hard because it's not an easy thing to do.
Exactly. It's a skill, you would say.
I think it's a skill, and you can get better at this. And I mean, I'm not good at this, but I think I'm on the path, and I just want to become better at this.
Yeah.
Just try to listen, because I mean, I think I just at this point I don't have a perspective. At least I have a perspective, but I kind of give it up. I can change my perspective. Like, well, this is what I say. It's like my perspective is like to change perspective. You know, I mean, it's just like to constantly like it's like a fuzzy flux of ideas that I read this source and I just like this sounds legit.
Yeah,
like I read this source, like this sounds legit.
Yeah, I want to also mention something I think that we talked about last time, I think 2 days ago or last week. Sorry, about like the difference of perspective and opinions.
Yeah.
And I think perspective is something that is inherently tied to vision and seeing, and like a viewpoint. And and sometimes there is a phenomenon out there in the world that you might just see it differently from another person because you are standing in a different position. And I think the example that we talked about was like, for example, imagine there is a number in our table. It's 6 for me, and it's 9 for you.
Yeah.
And none of us actually wrong.
Yeah.
Because from where we see it, I see 6, you see 9, and you're trying to tell me it's not 6, it's just 9.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying
you can
to say,
kill another person, just like, you know,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And that's the challenge of perspectives.
Yeah, so I think it goes hand in hand with this idea of being able to understand other perspectives, because eventually you need to come up to this understanding that there is no right way of viewing the world. I mean, like, it's interesting to draw analogies, like, you know, in physics back in the day, they believed that there is like some universal kind of stratum where everything is moving, and everything is moving like in relation to this kind of stratum, or like ether, they called it, like some. So there is like some space in the sense of like some universal thing out there, and everything is moving in the space in relation to it. And then, like, you know, Einstein came and he said, like, yeah, like no, actually, like, you know, like every kind of like the whole point of relativity is like things are relative to each other. Like, you know, there is no point of reference that is like universal. And maybe it's like should be the same in social sciences, like just an understanding that every perspective like really valuable.
Yeah, and it goes back to your question, I think, when you said, how do you explain to like this Western about like your perspective? You know, it's like I go back to this example of the 6 and 9 when you see it 9 and I see it 6, and I think the answer to your question would be that there should be this perhaps somewhat overwhelming desire from the other person to come all the way to where you are, which is very hard. I mean, it's practically impossible, but just get close to his perspective.
Exactly.
And try to see things from your point of view, which I think is really hard because you need a lot of critical thinking, you need a lot of desire, just a lot of effort to do that. And I'm sure there are people in the West also to have a somewhat more realistic perspective of Russia.
Yeah, and I think on the one hand, I feel there is a reason there is a reason that is a difficult thing to do. Like, you know, that's why it's not really it hasn't been figured out yet, or at least there is a work to be done on this front.
Yeah, but don't you think it's like a deeply human thing? Like, I think what we somewhat miss in the West is also this lack of compassion. Like, you have this overwhelming individuality.
Yeah.
And everyone's perspective matters, but at the end of the day, that means your perspective just matters to you. Like, you know, I have a different perspective, then your perspective doesn't matter to me that much. You know what I mean?
Maybe it's actually, I haven't thought about it this way. Yeah, I guess it has a certain, interesting point. Maybe you're right, because I mean, I'm actually like, again, I'm very perplexed by this idea of how people who truly believe in individualism don't have humility to get to know other perspectives.
Because I think the individuality that is in our mind probably very different, because when you are raised in the West, you are embedded in these ideas of individuality. I think for us, we have to, because we didn't really experience it for some time in our life, we had this idea of individuality, and then we saw and said, oh, okay, first of all, the idea I had is very different. This is, but then you see like the individuality, like very other ideas that we thought very like sort of somehow very high regarded, like academia, truth, information, freedom of speech is also something that these people had, but they never really understood it in a way that we did, because we never had it in some part of our life, and then we came here and start having them. So we're not really embedded in this culture in the way that it defines individuality. We're still kind of like outside in a way that we define individuality. And I think our way is perhaps a little bit more critical, because we've seen two perspectives, not just one, and we're like deeply embedded in one. Maybe we used to be deeply embedded in one, and then we came here and it's kind of like burst our bubble and start understanding that what actually all of these ideas are, and also individuality, probably one of those concepts that's very different in their mind because they grew up in a Western society than us, that kind of always first start reading about this individuality and then sort of came to know it when they were already like adults and kind of like progressed in thinking.
Yeah, but it also, for me, it comes to like those simple things that I think like the way I would say English speaking culture operates, it's way much more like it's way much easier to be a performer speaking English language. That's why we record in English, and I feel it gets the access to like, you know, to performance easier than any other like probably language in the world right now.
What do you mean?
It's like it's easier to be kind of like to self-express, like so to speak. It's
much alive, I feel like.
Yeah, it's easier to just be someone, like, you know, you are someone, like, you know, than in any like in comparison to Russian and stuff like this. And even in writing, for example, it also like I guess shows up. I mean, like those like small details, but of course I feel like eventually there is a level of like, you know, of self-expression that you can achieve only in the West, because some ideas that you can, like we discussed right now, like in Russia, like people would be even way much worse stuck in their own thinking, in their own perspective, that they just like they just, I mean, it's not that they would just never listen to other like ideas. They would just like they would just kill you before you even say something.
Wow.
Like that bad, like in terms of they have that kind of like like just not in their bubble but in their head, so to speak. They just don't want to.
And I think it's a two-way street, because like obviously the culture came about by the writings, like the philosophical writings, by the political writings, and they used language to express those, and they just get like continuously better at it. And then they also shaped culture and they shaped language, and then English became this language of self-expression, and you know, I think one way to look at it is just historically, and also like, you know, just the role of English and how the culture sort of gave birth to it, but also was influenced by it in a sense. And I definitely agree with you, because these ideas existed. Also, it gave this opportunity to the language to be able to give individuals this, you know, ability and facility to express themselves. Yeah,
that's certainly right. But then it comes to this interesting question: how do they miss, like, you know, other perspectives, and how do they? How do you go about this?
Yeah,
like,
I think what we also sometimes lack is also the same thing, like seeing the world from their perspective. When I, for example, have conversation with not people who are in academia, just normal people like at work or different places, and then you see how deeply embedded they are in this narratives. But also it helps me to understand them as well. Like, we are to some extent the elites, because we were in academia, and we're also sort of susceptible to see the world from that perspective. I think everyone are elite in terms of like everyone possesses this skill of critical thinking, but not everybody does that.
But do you think they simply miss kind of like our experience of being outsiders and coming like to a place, or another way, like maybe it's like they're missing this idea that there's something else in the world, like that's
certainly one element. And then I think we are also a very specific branch of like foreigners, because we also we study social sciences. We study these cultures. So it's very different, because we are actually like to some extent think, especially when I talk to people who come from academia like our age, I realize their image of the world is that every other person is like them. It's like every person has this a skill of knowing good from bad. And when I talk to them, oftentimes I feel like they, especially when they talk about this like utopian images that should be in the West, then I realize that the way they look at other people is that there are the same elite people, and they don't realize that I'm sorry, but there are a lot of also bad people out there.
Yeah.
And the difference between that bad person and like a person like you, who's I assume is a good person and doesn't want to, you know, corrupt society, is that good person, for example, goes into politics, they do their time for 4 years, 8 years, and they go, you know, about their business. But then there is always this person who comes up and shows up in this society that has this deep sort of tendency and longing for become this dictator. You know, they sort of overlook the evil in the world because they're inside. There are good people. I assume there are good people, but they don't. They fail to empathize with the evil or like people who are generally evil. I mean, I'm not saying that it's their fault, but there's incident of these people getting power and, you know, fucking ruining society.
It's true, but it's also, to me, it's deeply interesting. Why is it so? And of course, yeah, I think like if there is a one like benefit to Western system is the idea of course, like keeping in check people who really want to get like this much power.
Exactly.
Because I think it is like to a certain degree.
It's the biggest.
Yeah, I guess it's almost proven that it is a part of like human nature to get as much powerful as possible, and with having, I would say, states and all those big governments, and it's that easy to get that much power. Like, you know, I mean, not easy, but it's really conceivable to get that much powerful, and I guess it's good to have some checks. But yeah, I guess let's warp it up. I mean, it was a hell of a conversation.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, but for me, it's just the way I want to end it, and just, you know, thinking about again like perspectives. Yeah, I think it is just important to try to convey to the Westerners that there are different ways of thinking, and like they can do whatever they want with this idea. They can deny and they can, you know, go all in and say like, yeah, like, you know, we don't really care, but at least they should articulate their own kind of position. And even if this position is like, you know, like, well, like our perspective is the best one.
Yeah, and
to be honest, like they should be honest, like, you know, like this is their vision, like.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, that also goes back to this understanding the difference, I think, between opinion and the perspective. Because it can be the case that your opinion is wrong and my opinion is right in some cases. Yeah. But then perspective is not really wrong or right or wrong. It's just how these people see the world, and there's always some truth to it. Yeah, some propaganda in it, some wrong in it.
From my again, it's like, it's actually interesting because from your point of view, it's always true. It's like if you have a perspective. I mean, like if you were me and you happen to be me and you happen to have like to kind of like complete all the steps and you come to the same conclusion, and you're just like, yeah, it's like.
Exactly. And then at the end of the day, I think, it goes back to compassion, bro. Yeah. It's like this, you have to have some compassion for other people, even though you feel like they're bad people or like maybe like lost people, not necessarily bad. But I think you need to have that type of compassion to just put yourself in other people's shoe. Exactly. And that's something I think missing, or maybe it's also like a side effect of individualism. That's a different topic.
Well, definitely we'll think about it. It's actually an interesting idea. I haven't thought about it. Well, then we'll keep, I guess, discussing it in the future. I guess cheers and
thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me too.
See you next episode.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.